It began on an ordinary afternoon at a war memorial parking lot. An elderly man, 81 years old, pulled up in his car with a handicap permit clearly displayed. His name was Walter Chen, a Vietnam veteran, decorated with 3 Purple Hearts and a silver star. Every year, he visited this wall to honor his fallen brothers, but this time, something went wrong. 3 young men were blocking the handicapped space, cameras rolling, laughter spilling into the air. When Walter politely asked them to move, they saw not a veteran, not a man who sacrificed for his country. They saw an opportunity for content. Phones lifted. Red lights blinked on. The so-called prank began. A hand came down, fast and cruel, across Walter's face. The old soldier stumbled back. His hearing aid kicked across the asphalt, his hands bleeding as he tried to steady himself. Laughter followed. Taunts followed. "Can't hear me now, Grandpa?" To them it was entertainment. To Walter it was humiliation. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that 40 men were watching from inside the building. 40 bikers, brothers bound not by cameras but by code. The Iron Eagles Motorcycle Club was holding their monthly meeting, and from the back room they had seen every second of the cruelty unfolding in that lot. The scrape of chairs echoed like thunder. Boots struck the floor in rhythm, 40 strong. Not rushing, not running. Walking in formation. A storm was gathering, and it was walking toward the young men who thought they were untouchable. The air shifted. The laughter died. The predator became the prey. The bikers closed in, circling Walter first, shielding him, protecting him. Then their eyes locked on the boy with the phone, the one bragging to 3 million followers about cruelty disguised as pranks. They knew his name. They knew his record. Every video that had mocked the vulnerable, every so-called stunt built on the pain of others. And now, justice was no longer behind a screen. It was standing in leather and steel, breathing down his neck. The leader stepped forward, calm, controlled, unstoppable. He demanded one thing: accountability. Delete the videos. Every single one built on hurting people. The boy laughed at first. He thought he still held the power, still held the audience. But then the circle closed tighter. The truth settled heavy on him. This wasn't just content. This was assault. And the evidence was his own. Walter tried to raise a hand to ask for peace. Even after the slap, even after the mockery, the old veteran didn't want blood. But his plea for restraint only showed the bikers one thing: what true strength really looks like. Because Walter wasn't afraid of fists. He had taken blows from professionals who wanted him dead. No, what hurt him most was something else entirely. What hurt him was that a young man would raise a hand not for defense, not for duty, but for attention. That a boy with everything still chose to be cruel. That to Walter was worse than pain, and so he told a story. The story of another Tyler, a corporal just 22 years old who threw himself on a grenade so his brothers could live. The last words that young hero spoke were for Walter, to live a good life for the both of them. Walter had carried those words for 50 years, and now, staring at the boy who shared the name but not the honor, Walter spoke the truth. You live for views. He died for meaning. The crowd was silent. The bikers did not move. The boy began to realize the weight of the name he had been mocking, and then the sound of sirens cut through the air. Red and blue lights flashed across leather vests and trembling hands. The question hung in the air: would this be the end of a cruel joke? Or the beginning of something very different? The sirens washed the lot in blue and red, but no one moved first. Not the bikers, not the boy, not the man who'd come to speak the names of the fallen. For a breath, time held its ground. Then the officers stepped out, steady, measured, watching the scene with practiced eyes. What they saw was not a brawl but a line. 40 men standing between cruelty and the one it tried to break. A camera still recorded, a hand still shook, and an old soldier stood taller than his years. An apology was spoken into a lens, the kind that tastes like gravel the first time you force it out. But words without weight are just air. Walter made them heavy. He chose mercy, the rare kind that does not erase consequence. Forgiveness, yes, but not an escape. A line drawn where dignity begins. The officers did their work. Cuffs clicked, not as a spectacle but as a boundary. Some lessons require paper and courtrooms. Some require quiet and the long walk back to yourself. The crowd exhaled. The laughter that started the day was gone, replaced by something older: respect. By nightfall, the internet had done what it always does. It raced to watch. But for once, it did more than gawk. Sponsors stepped away. Followers vanished like a tide running out. A sleek car went back to the dealer, a toy reclaimed when the bill came due. And a channel that fed on humiliation tasted its first famine. Yet somewhere in that same storm, something beautiful rose. News traveled of the veteran who gave mercy and asked for better. Donations poured in, not for Walter, but for those still fighting a quieter war on the streets. $200,000 in 3 days. Walter didn't keep a cent. He sent every dollar to the men and women too often forgotten once the parade's end. The Iron Eagles honored him in their own way. A vest across his shoulders, patches that told a story without a single shouted word. Vietnam veteran. Protected by the Iron Eagles. Brothers on wheels. Guardians in leather. They made room not just for a man, but for a memory. A sidecar appeared, welded with care, polished by hands that know what it costs to stand firm. On Veterans Day, engines rumbled like distant thunder and the convoy rolled. 40 boots, 1 sidecar, a road that looked like a promise kept. Walter rode not above them but among them, the wind threading through his fingers like a prayer. Months passed. Winter softened at the edges. On a quiet morning at the memorial, footsteps approached, a different rhythm, smaller, unsure. The boy returned, minus the armor of fashion and followers. No camera, no crowd, only an envelope, wrinkled from being opened and closed 100 times, and a confession that didn't need a microphone. $5,000 earned the hard way. The honest way. 3 jobs, fewer excuses, a small sum to the internet. A great one to a man who knows the price of change. Walter took it not as payment, but as proof. Growth is currency that never inflates. They sat on a bench that had heard more secrets than most people ever will. Walter spoke of a different Tyler, the one who traded his tomorrows for his brother's today. He spoke of courage that doesn't trend, of sacrifice that never asks to be filmed. He told stories that fit into the spaces between names etched in stone, stories that teach the living how to carry the dead with honor. The boy listened. Really listened. He did not argue with the truth. He made a promise not to be perfect but to be better. It was enough to begin. From that promise came a seed with a name, the Tyler Patterson Honor Initiative. A room full of teenagers and first chances. A banner that did not celebrate mistakes but the turning from them. Bikers in cut vests speaking softly about respect. A humbled young man standing beside them, telling the story of how he chased fame and found character instead. I slapped a hero and got slapped by karma, he tells them. Not to shock but to warn. Not to trend but to teach. Some laugh at first, then stop when they realize the punchline is on all of us if we don't learn. And Walter? He walks a little slower now. His hands shake more when he traces the letters of the names he refuses to forget. But he doesn't stand alone. When he faces the wall, 40 bikers face it with him. A living fortress around a man who understands the difference between strength and force, between noise and meaning. Respect is not a clip. Honor is not a hashtag. Mercy is not weakness. And redemption is not a sprint. It is a road ridden in formation, steady and true. So the story ends where it began. At the memorial, in the wind, with a man and the brothers who stand behind him. Not because the internet demanded it, but because the code did. A code that says you don't mock sacrifice. You don't prey on the weak. You don't raise a hand for views. You stand, you protect, you remember. And if you fall, you get back up the hard way. One apology, one day, one honest act at a time. That is how a slap meant for attention became a lesson for a generation. That is how the noise dimmed and the meaning remained. And that is why when the engines start and the boots fall in rhythm, some stories ride on, long after the cameras stop. Months turned into years, but the memory of that day didn't fade. It didn't vanish like a headline. It grew roots. The Iron Eagles, once only a wall of leather and steel, became teachers. They stood not just for vengeance, but for guidance. And with Walter at their side, they carried his story into schools, community halls, youth centers, anywhere the next generation might need to hear it. Because the lesson was bigger than one slap. It was about what happens when cruelty is normalized, when hurting someone becomes entertainment, and when honor, true honor, is treated like an afterthought. The Tyler Patterson Honor Initiative became more than a name. It became a bridge between eras, between those who bled in jungles and those scrolling through screens, It taught respect the hard way, the old way, through stories, through scars, through living witnesses, and among those witnesses was a young man, no longer famous, but finally useful. Tyler Brooks. The same boy who once laughed at pain now stood in front of strangers admitting his own. He didn't flinch from it. He didn't dress it up. He told it plain. I slapped a hero and got slapped by karma. And every time he said it, he traded shame for strength, and his audience left a little wiser than they arrived. Walter Chen, now 84, still came to the wall. His steps were slower, his hands shook more, but his voice never broke when he spoke the names. And behind him, always behind him, stood the Iron Eagles, a formation of brothers who understood that some battles don't end when the war does. The story had started with a slap meant to humiliate. It ended with a lesson meant to endure. Respect isn't content, honor isn't clickbait, and mercy given at the right moment can change more than one life. So when the engines roar and the boots strike pavement in rhythm, the message is clear. You don't mock sacrifice. You don't prey on the weak. And you never ever forget the ones who carried you here. Because one day it won't be about views or trends or algorithms. It will be about whether you left the world with more dignity than you found it. That's the ride worth taking. That's the legacy worth leaving. And so the story comes full circle. From a parking lot confrontation born of arrogance, to a brotherhood stand for justice, to a young man learning the cost of chasing views instead of values. Walter Chen still returns to the wall. The names don't change, but the way people see them does. Because now his story isn't just about what he endured, it's about what he inspired. 40 bikers stood that day to protect one man. But in truth, they stood for something larger. They stood for every veteran who's carried scars the world doesn't see. They stood for every person mocked when they should have been respected. They stood for the idea that character will always matter more than clout. And that is the heartbeat of this lesson. Respect is not optional. Honor is not a trend, mercy is not weakness, and true brotherhood never forgets. If you carry anything from this story, let it be this. Don't wait until life teaches you through pain. Choose dignity now. Stand up for those who can't stand alone. And if you ever wonder what it means to live a good life, remember Walter's words. Live it not just for yourself, but for those who gave everything so you could. Because views fade, fame dies, but respect that lasts. And honor, that rides on. Pause, soft fade in music. If this story moved you, share it. Let it remind others of the price of sacrifice and the power of respect. And if you know a veteran, thank them, not with words, but with action. Support them, stand with them, and never forget what they gave. Because in the end, the world doesn't need more clicks. It needs more character.